The morning light filtering through the tall windows of the Cliff House carried a deceptive calm, the kind that often arrived before everything unraveled. Steffi Forrester Finnegan had learned to distrust that kind of quiet. It reminded her too much of the moments before catastrophe, before the truth revealed itself in sharp edges and irreversible consequences. Her life, her family, and the long shadow cast by Sheila Sharp had taught her that danger rarely announced itself loudly. It whispered, it lingered, it waited until someone was careless enough to believe that the worst was over. On this particular morning, Steffi's instincts were screaming, and she did not intend to ignore them. Her concern was not abstract or distant. It was immediate and personal, tied to her mother, Taylor Hayes, whose compassion had always been both her greatest strength and her most dangerous vulnerability. Steffi loved her mother fiercely, admired her resilience and her ability to rebuild herself after unimaginable heartbreak. Yet that same empathy had, time and again, drawn Taylor toward people who existed on the edge of chaos. This time, the name attached to that chaos was Deacon Sharp, and behind Deacon, like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired, stood Sheila. Steffi arrived at Taylor's office without warning, the echo of her heels against the polished floor, announcing her presence before she even spoke. She had not planned to burst in like this, had not intended to let her emotions take control, but the words she had overheard outside the door replayed relentlessly in her mind. A tone that was too intimate, a pause that lingered too long, a familiarity that had nothing to do with professional boundaries. These were not small details to Steffi, they were alarm bells. Taylor barely had time to look up before Steffi confronted her, her voice sharp with a mix of fear and frustration that she had been suppressing for days. There was no gentle easing into the conversation, no polite pretense. Steffi demanded answers, demanded honesty, demanded to know why her mother appeared to be crossing a line that should never be crossed. Taylor, taken aback, attempted to explain, to frame the situation in clinical terms, to remind Steffi of her oath, her ethics, her decades of experience. But Steffi was not convinced, and deep down, Taylor knew why. The issue was not simply that Taylor was treating Deacon as a patient. It was that something had shifted, something subtle yet undeniable. Steffi could see it in her mother's eyes, hear it in the way her voice softened when Deacon's name was mentioned. It was the same look Steffi had seen before, the look that preceded heartbreak, scandal, and danger. Steffi's fear was not born of jealousy or control. It was born of memory. Memory of Sheila's manipulations. Memory of bloodshed, of threats, of a woman who thrived on obsession and revenge. Steffi spoke with a clarity sharpened by years of hard-earned wisdom. She reminded Taylor that feelings, however human, did not exist in a vacuum. The therapist falling for a patient was not merely unprofessional. It was destructive, capable of undoing careers and lives alike. She warned her mother that even the perception of impropriety could be weaponized, especially by someone like Sheila, who needed little encouragement to turn suspicion into violence. Steffi's words were not meant to shame Taylor, but to protect her, to pull her back from a precipice before it was too late. Taylor listened, her expression shifting from defensiveness to quiet unease. She wanted to argue, to insist that she was in control, that she understood the risks. Yet beneath that confidence lay a truth she could not deny. She had allowed herself to care too deeply. In her sessions with Deacon, she had seen not just a man seeking redemption, but a man desperate to be understood. And in trying to understand him, she had opened a door within herself that she had long kept closed. It was not love, she told herself, but connection. Still, she knew how thin the distinction could be. Steffi pressed her point with urgency, emphasizing that the greatest threat was not gossip or professional consequences, but Sheila herself. Sheila was unpredictable, volatile, and possessive. If she sensed that Deacon's attention had shifted, even emotionally, the fallout could be catastrophic. Steffi begged her mother to end whatever this was before it escalated, before Sheila found out and decided to retaliate. It was not a hypothetical danger, it was a certainty, one grounded in lived experience and scars that still ached. Taylor promised to think about it, to reflect, to reassess. Yet, even as Steffi left the office, a measure of doubt lingered. Promises were easy in moments of clarity. It was the quiet, lonely moments that tested resolve. Steffi could only hope that her warning had landed deeply enough to alter her mother's course. Across town, at Il Giardino, Deacon Sharp found himself grappling with a different kind of turmoil. The familiar hum of the restaurant offered little comfort as he confided in Deke Sharp, a man who knew his flaws, his failures, and his endless cycle of poor decisions. Deacon spoke in measured tones at first, skirting the edges of the truth, as if afraid that naming it would make it real. He talked about therapy, about self-improvement, about trying to become someone worthy of redemption. But beneath those words pulsed an admission he could no longer suppress. Deacon confessed that something unexpected had happened during his sessions with Taylor. He spoke of her kindness, her patience, the way she listened without judgment. He admitted that he felt seen in a way he never had before, that her belief in his potential stirred something dangerous within him. He acknowledged the irony and the wrongdoing inherent in developing feelings for his therapist, fully aware of how wrong it was, how unethical, how doomed it could be. Yet awareness did not diminish desire. If anything, it intensified it. Deke listened, his expression a blend of concern and resignation. He had heard versions of this story before, had watched Deacon sabotage himself repeatedly. Deacon insisted that he was trying to recommit to Sheila, to make their marriage work, to prove that he could choose stability over chaos. But even as he said the words, he knew they rang hollow. His heart was pulling him in another direction, toward a woman who represented healing rather than destruction. And that contrast alone made the choice feel impossible. Deacon wavered between full confession and self-protection. He hinted that there was someone else, someone who made him question everything, but he avoided naming Taylor outright. Part of him hoped that by keeping it vague, he could contain the damage. Another part of him feared that the truth, once spoken, would unleash consequences he could not survive. What Deacon did not know, or perhaps did not want to know, was that Sheila was nearby, listening. Sheila's presence was as silent as it was menacing. She absorbed every word, every hesitation, every implication, her mind already spinning narratives of betrayal and revenge. The idea that Deacon's loyalty might be divided ignited a familiar fury within her, one that demanded action rather than reflection. Sheila did not need confirmation, suspicion alone was enough. In her world, love was ownership, and any perceived threat to that ownership had to be eliminated. While danger brewed at Il Giardino, a different kind of emotional crossroads unfolded at the Forrester Gallery. The space, usually alive with creativity and ambition, became the backdrop for an intimate confrontation between Daphne Rose and Carter Walton. Daphne stood at the threshold, her decision seemingly made, her resolve fortified by logic and self-preservation. She believed that returning to Paris was the right choice, that distance would spare them both from heartache and complication. Carter, however, refused to accept her departure as inevitable. His love for Daphne was not cautious or measured. It was wholehearted, driven by a certainty he rarely felt. As Daphne moved toward the door, Carter acted on instinct, dropping to one knee in a gesture that stunned them both. It was not calculated or rehearsed. It was the physical manifestation of everything he had been holding back, every fear of loss, every hope for a shared future. He spoke of love not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality, something he felt in every quiet moment they shared and every challenge they faced together. He told her that she was not a chapter or a detour, but the destination itself. His proposal was not just an offer of marriage, but a plea for her to believe in what they had built, to trust that their bond could withstand uncertainty and sacrifice. Daphne was torn between the life she had planned and the future Carter was offering. She feared that staying would mean losing herself, yet leaving felt like abandoning something rare and profound. Carter's vulnerability disarmed her, forcing her to confront her own feelings with honesty she had been avoiding. He envisioned a life where they stood together, where engagement was not an ending, but a beginning, a declaration that they chose each other despite fear. As the day unfolded, these parallel stories wove together into a tapestry of desire, danger, and devotion. Steffi's warning echoed in the background, a reminder that love, when entangled with unresolved trauma and dangerous individuals, could become a weapon. Deacon's confession highlighted the fragility of redemption when temptation lingered too close. Sheila's silent rage promised consequences yet unseen, and Carter's proposal illuminated the courage it took to believe in love without guarantees. Each character stood at a crossroads, faced with choices that would define their futures. The tension lay not only in what they would decide, but in how those decisions would ripple outward, affecting everyone within their orbit. In a world where past sins refused to stay buried and emotions carried the power to heal or destroy, nothing was simple and no choice was without cost. The calm of the morning had long since vanished, replaced by an undercurrent of inevitability, as if the universe itself were holding its breath, waiting to see who would emerge unscathed and who would be consumed by the very passions they could not deny. The news did not arrive like a thunderclap. It seeped in quietly, almost deceptively, the way truths often do when they are about to change everything. For Hope Logan and Deke Sharp, the revelation that their father's marriage to Sheila Carter was unraveling did not inspire shock or grief. It inspired relief so sharp it bordered on euphoria, a feeling both exhilarating and deeply unsettling. For years, they had lived with the uneasy compromise of acceptance without approval, tolerance without trust. They had stood by Deacon Sharp not because they believed in his choice, but because they believed in him, and because sometimes love for a parent required swallowing a truth that tasted like poison. Now, that poison seemed to be losing its grip. Hope experienced the realization first as a tightening in her chest, then as a loosening she had not felt in years. Sheila Carter was not simply a woman her father had married. She was a symbol of everything dangerous and uncontrollable in his life, a living reminder that Deacon's desire for redemption often led him straight back into chaos. Hope had tried to be gracious, to be the bigger person, to model forgiveness and restraint. Yet no amount of grace could erase the knowledge of who Sheila truly was, a woman whose history was written in blood, manipulation, and obsession. A woman who had pulled triggers and orchestrated kidnappings without remorse, a woman who had shot her own son and then expected the world to forget. Hope had accepted Sheila's presence the way one accepts a storm cloud on the horizon, always aware that it could break without warning. Deke, by contrast, had never bothered to hide his discomfort. Where Hope wrestled with guilt over her lack of compassion, Deke allowed himself anger, sharp and unfiltered. He had watched Sheila with narrowed eyes, cataloging her moods, her silences, her sudden sweetness. He had seen through the performance long before anyone else, recognizing it as the same kind of act Deacon himself used to put on when he wanted forgiveness without accountability. For Deke, Sheila was not just a threat to Deacon's safety, but an insult to his children, a declaration that their father valued danger over stability, drama over peace. Learning that the marriage was faltering felt like a validation he had waited far too long to receive. Together, Hope and Deke shared a moment of unspoken understanding, a glance heavy with years of shared concern and suppressed fear. They did not need to articulate what they were thinking. The same thought echoed between them. This was an opportunity, perhaps the only one they would ever get, to finally remove Sheila from their lives for good. And once that thought took hold, it began to grow, branching into possibilities both hopeful and morally ambiguous. They knew their father well enough to understand that nothing was ever simple with Deacon Sharp. His heart was impulsive, his loyalty easily swayed by emotion rather than reason. If his marriage to Sheila was cracking, it was not enough to simply stand back and hope it collapsed on its own. Sheila was not the kind of woman who let go gracefully. She would fight, manipulate, and threaten until the very end. Hope and Deke understood that if they wanted Sheila gone, truly gone, they might have to push events along. To guide their father toward a choice he was already inching toward, but might be too afraid to make. The knowledge that there was another woman in Deacon's life changed everything. It was not merely a complication, it was leverage. Hope felt a flicker of guilt at how quickly her mind shifted from concern to strategy, but she pushed it aside. This was not about cruelty, she told herself. It was about safety, about protecting her father from a woman who had proven time and again that she destroyed everything she touched. If Deacon's heart was already elsewhere, then encouraging him to follow it was not manipulation. It was liberation. Yet even as Hope framed it that way, she could not ignore the moral unease curling beneath her resolve. She prided herself on honesty, on kindness, on doing the right thing even when it was difficult. What she and Deke were contemplating existed in a gray area that made her uncomfortable. Was it truly right to nudge their father away from his wife, even one as dangerous as Sheila? Did good intentions excuse calculated interference? These questions haunted Hope, but they did not stop her. Fear had a way of overpowering doubt, and fear of Sheila was something Hope knew intimately. Deke, meanwhile, felt no such hesitation. To him, the plan was simple. Identify the weakness, apply pressure, and remove the threat. He had watched his father nearly lose everything too many times to believe in passive hope. If Deacon was wavering, then he needed support, encouragement, and perhaps a reminder of what a healthier life could look like. Deke saw the other woman not as an interloper, but as a lifeline, someone who could anchor Deacon in something resembling normalcy. If that meant playing matchmaker or subtly undermining Sheila's hold, so be it. What neither Hope nor Deke fully anticipated was how unaware the woman at the center of this emotional storm truly was. Taylor Hayes had entered Deacon's life with the purest of intentions, believing herself to be firmly grounded in professionalism and purpose. She had taken Deacon on as a patient not because she believed in him romantically, but because she believed in the possibility of change. To Taylor, therapy was sacred, a space where even the most broken individuals could confront themselves without fear of judgment. She had seen Deacon as a man struggling against his worst instincts, desperate to prove that he was more than his past. At first, their sessions had followed a predictable rhythm. Deacon spoke, Taylor listened. He confessed his doubts, his frustrations, his longing to be better, to be worthy of his children's respect. Taylor guided him gently, helping him unpack the patterns that led him repeatedly into destructive relationships. Sheila's name surfaced often, heavy with contradiction. Deacon described his marriage as both a refuge and a prison, a bond forged in shared darkness that now threatened to consume what little light he had left. Taylor encouraged him to confront those contradictions honestly, to examine whether his loyalty to Sheila was rooted in love or in fear of being alone. What Taylor did not anticipate was how deeply Deacon's vulnerability would resonate with her own unhealed wounds. She had spent a lifetime caring for others, absorbing their pain while neglecting her own. Listening to Deacon speak of redemption stirred something within her, a longing to believe not only in his transformation, but in the idea that broken people could find peace together. She told herself that her compassion was purely clinical, that her warmth was part of the therapeutic process. But emotions do not always respect boundaries, no matter how carefully they are drawn. The moment Taylor realized she was developing feelings for Deacon arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet, devastating awareness. It surfaced in the way she thought of him outside their sessions, in the concern that lingered after he left her office, in the warmth that spread through her chest when he smiled with genuine gratitude rather than charm. She knew, with professional certainty, that this was wrong. A therapist falling for a patient was a breach of ethics that could destroy careers and lives. Yet knowing something was wrong did not make it disappear. Taylor remained oblivious to the fact that Hope and Deke were beginning to orbit her, nudging Deacon subtly, carefully, toward his heart. They spoke to him of happiness, of second chances, of choosing a life that did not require constant vigilance. Hope framed her encouragement in gentle terms, reminding her father that he deserved love that was not built on fear or manipulation. She spoke of therapy as a gift, of the importance of finding someone who truly understood him. Her words were careful, never explicitly naming Taylor, but the implication was clear enough to plant seeds. Deke was less subtle. He challenged his father directly, questioning whether staying with Sheila was an act of love or an act of surrender. He spoke bluntly about Sheila's history, about the danger she posed not just to Deacon, but to everyone connected to him. He argued that choosing a different path was not betrayal, but survival. Together, Hope and Deke formed a quiet but persistent chorus, urging Deacon to listen to the part of himself he had long ignored. Deacon found himself torn in ways he could barely articulate. On one hand, he felt a sense of obligation to Sheila, a belief that abandoning her would confirm every accusation ever leveled against him. On the other hand, his connection with Taylor offered something he had never truly experienced, the possibility of growth without punishment, intimacy without chaos. The guilt of his feelings warred constantly with the relief they brought. He knew that falling in love with his therapist was wrong, knew that ending his marriage under these circumstances would unleash consequences he might not survive. Yet the idea of continuing as he was felt increasingly unbearable. As Deacon moved closer to a decision, the specter of Sheila loomed ever larger. Viewers watching from the safety of their living rooms understood what Hope and Deke could only fear. Sheila would not accept rejection quietly. The discovery of Deacon's feelings for Taylor would ignite a rage far more dangerous than jealousy. For Sheila, love was possession, and possession once threatened had to be reclaimed at any cost. Her fury would not be limited to Deacon alone. Taylor, as the perceived interloper, would become a target, and anyone who encouraged the relationship would find themselves in Sheila's crosshairs. Complicating matters further was Steffy Forrester, whose protective instincts toward her mother were sharpened by years of trauma inflicted by Sheila. Steffy viewed the burgeoning connection between Taylor and Deacon not as a romantic opportunity, but as a ticking time bomb. She saw danger where others saw hope, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to shield her mother from harm. To Steffy, the idea that Hope Logan might be encouraging this relationship felt like betrayal layered upon recklessness. The notion that their families could be entangled through romance was intolerable, a convergence of histories too dark to ignore. The tension between these competing motivations created an atmosphere thick with inevitability. Hope and Deke pushed forward, driven by a desire for safety and normalcy. Taylor struggled silently with feelings she knew she should not have, caught between professional duty and personal longing. Deacon stood at the center, pulled in opposing directions by guilt, love, and fear. And Sheila, sensing the shift even before the truth was revealed, prepared to strike back against a world that refused to belong to her. The question of whether anyone felt sympathy for Sheila lingered uncomfortably in the background. Was it possible to pity a woman whose life had been defined by violence and obsession? Could loneliness and fear ever excuse the harm she caused? Hope grappled with this question more than she cared to admit. Part of her recognized that Sheila's rage was born of desperation, of a terror of abandonment so profound it eclipsed reason. But compassion had limits, and for Hope, those limits had been reached long ago. As the fragile hope of a new family structure began to take shape in Hope and Dek's minds, the obstacles became increasingly clear. Sheila's wrath, Steffy's opposition, and the ethical boundaries Taylor could not ignore all stood in the way. The path forward was narrow and treacherous, demanding sacrifices that no one was fully prepared to make. Yet, despite the danger, despite the looming chaos, Hope and Deke pressed on, determined to rewrite their father's story even if it meant risking their own peace. In the end, the question was not simply whether Deacon would choose Taylor over Sheila or whether Hope and Deke would succeed in their efforts. The deeper question was whether love, once entangled with fear and manipulation, could ever be truly freed. As alliances shifted and emotions intensified, one truth remained unshakable: no one would emerge from this unscathed. The choices made in this fragile moment would reverberate through their lives, reshaping families, igniting conflicts, and proving once again that in a world built on secrets and desire, even the purest intentions could lead to devastating consequences.